Every year on November 11th, he came here, not because he had to, but because he believed that memory must live in children. He had no invitation in his pocket, no medals pinned to his chest, only a heart that carried the weight of all those who never made it home. The November morning of 2024 was crisp with the kind of cold that made breath visible and reminded everyone that winter was coming to Franklin High School in Ohio. Elijah Moore adjusted his gray blazer and pulled his ROTC baseball cap down slightly against the wind as he approached the main entrance of the school, where he had once taught for 22 years. In his weathered hands, he carried a faded program from the 1997 Veterans Day Assembly, the first one he had organized when the ceremony was nothing more than a lunch break announcement and a moment of silence. The paper was soft with age, the edges worn from being handled by fingers that had held much more than school programs over the decades. Elijah moved with the deliberate pace of a man who understood that some things could not be rushed. His 76-year-old frame still carried the bearing of someone who had spent years teaching young people to stand straight, speak clearly, and understand that discipline was not punishment but preparation. If you enjoy our stories and want to support our channel, please hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps our channel grow. Now, let's return to our story. The school looked different from when he had walked these halls as an educator. New security cameras perched like mechanical birds above every entrance. Electronic locks hummed with quiet authority. Signs in multiple languages directed visitors through a maze of protocols that had not existed in his teaching days. But the November air still carried the same promise it always had. The promise of remembrance, of young voices raised in honor of those who had served, of minds open to stories that needed telling. Elijah reached the main entrance and paused for a moment, looking through the glass doors at the bustling activity inside. Students moved with the easy confidence of youth, their backpacks slung over shoulders that had never carried the weight of combat gear, their conversations filled with concerns about tests and weekend plans rather than survival and loss. He could see decorations going up in the main hallway, red, white, and blue streamers, posters with pictures of servicemen and women, a banner reading, "Franklin High honors our heroes." The sight brought a small smile to his weathered face. At least they were still doing it. At least the tradition he had started was continuing, even if he was no longer part of it. The security guard at the entrance was a young man, probably in his 30s, with the kind of professional courtesy that spoke of training and procedure. He wore a crisp uniform and an expression that was polite but firm. When Elijah approached the door, the guard stepped forward with practiced efficiency. "Good morning, sir," the guard said, his voice respectful but businesslike. "Are you here for the Veterans Day Assembly?" "I am," Elijah replied, his voice carrying the slight rasp that came with age and years of addressing classrooms full of teenagers. "I used to teach here. ROTC program." The guard consulted a tablet in his hands, scrolling through what appeared to be a guest list. "I'll need to see your name on the invitation list, sir. New security protocols. We can only admit registered guests today." Elijah reached into his blazer pocket, not for an invitation he knew he did not have, but for the old program he always carried. "I do not have a formal invitation," he said quietly. "I taught here for 22 years. I started this assembly when it was just a lunch announcement and 30 seconds of silence." The guard's expression softened slightly, but his resolve remained firm. "I understand, sir, and I appreciate your service, both military and educational. But without your name on the list, I cannot admit you. New district policies, no exceptions. It is nothing personal." Elijah studied the young man's face and saw something there that reminded him of his former students. Earnestness, a desire to do the right thing, but bound by rules that did not always make room for exceptions or understanding. He had seen that look 1,000 times in classrooms and on training grounds. "I understand," Elijah said, and he meant it. The world had changed since his teaching days. Security concerns that had once seemed theoretical had become very real. Rules that had once seemed unnecessarily rigid now served purposes he could appreciate, even if he did not like them. He did not argue or demand to speak to someone in charge. Instead, he simply nodded to the guard and stepped away from the entrance, walking slowly to a weathered wooden bench that sat beneath an old oak tree about 30 yards from the school's front doors. The bench had been there during his teaching years, though it looked older now, more weathered by seasons of rain and snow and summer heat. Students had carved initials into its surface over the years, creating a palimpsest of teenage love and friendship that spoke to the continuity of youth even as individual students graduated and moved on. Elijah sat down carefully, his joints protesting slightly against the November cold. From this vantage point, he could see through the large windows of the school's main hallway and gymnasium. He could watch the assembly preparations, see the students and families gathering, observe the ceremony he had once helped to create. It was not where he had planned to spend Veterans Day morning, but it was where he found himself. And if there was one thing his years of military service and teaching had taught him, it was that you made the best of whatever situation you found yourself in. He opened the old program and read the names listed under honored veterans, men and women from World War II, Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War. Some of those names belonged to people he had known personally, teachers and community members who had served their country before taking up civilian careers. Several of them were no longer alive. The wind picked up, rustling the last stubborn leaves that clung to the oak tree above him. Through the school windows, he could see students filing into the gymnasium, their voices creating a murmur that carried faintly through the glass. Parents and invited guests followed, many of them wearing military insignia or veteran organization pins. Inside the school, the Veterans Day assembly was beginning without him. Elijah Moore, former Army sergeant who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan, former ROTC instructor who had shaped the character of hundreds of young people, former teacher who had started the very tradition now taking place inside the building, sat on a bench outside and waited. He waited because waiting was something he knew how to do. He had waited in desert outposts for supply convoys that might or might not arrive. He had waited in field hospitals while medics worked on wounded soldiers. He had waited in empty classrooms after school for students who needed extra help or just someone to talk to. Waiting was not passive for Elijah Moore. It was a form of service, a way of being present even when you were not included, a method of bearing witness even when you were not invited to participate. Through the gymnasium windows, he could see a figure at a podium, probably the principal, addressing the assembled crowd. He could not hear the words, but he could imagine them. The same themes he had helped establish all those years ago: service, sacrifice, remembrance, the debt owed to those who had answered their country's call. The irony was not lost on him. He was sitting outside a ceremony dedicated to honoring veterans, excluded by policies designed to protect the very institution he had served. But irony had been a constant companion throughout his military and teaching careers. You learned to appreciate it rather than be embittered by it. A group of students passed by on the sidewalk, heading toward a side entrance to the school. They were wearing ROTC uniforms, crisp dress blues that reminded Elijah of his own cadet days, decades before he would wear the desert camouflage of a combat soldier or the business casual of a high school teacher. One of the students glanced in his direction, and Elijah saw something flicker across the young man's face. A moment of recognition or confusion, as if he had seen something familiar but could not quite place it. The student slowed his pace, falling behind his companions, and turned to look more directly at the man sitting on the bench. Elijah met his gaze with the kind of steady attention he had always given to his students, neither intrusive nor dismissive, but simply present and available. For a moment, the two of them looked at each other across the space that separated youth from age, student from teacher, present from past. Then the young man's companions called to him, and he hurried to catch up, disappearing through the side entrance of the school. But Elijah had seen something in that brief exchange that gave him hope. Recognition, perhaps, or at least curiosity. The kind of spark that suggested connections could still be made, even across barriers of policy and procedure. He settled back against the bench and pulled his baseball cap down against the wind. Inside the school, the Veterans Day assembly continued. Outside, a veteran sat in silence, carrying his own form of remembrance, holding his own version of honor. The morning was far from over. Inside Franklin High School, the Veterans Day assembly was proceeding with the kind of organized efficiency that marked successful school events. The gymnasium had been transformed into a ceremonial space, with American flags positioned at strategic intervals and a backdrop featuring the seals of all 5 military branches. Principal Rebecca Martinez stood at the podium, her voice carrying clearly through the wireless microphone system as she addressed the assembled crowd of students, parents, and invited veterans. She was a woman in her early 50s who had taken over the leadership of Franklin High 3 years earlier, bringing with her a commitment to academic excellence and community engagement. Today we gather to honor those who have served our nation with courage and dedication, Principal Martinez said, her words echoing off the gymnasium walls. We are privileged to have with us several distinguished veterans who have agreed to share their experiences with our students. The invited guests sat in a section of honor near the front of the gymnasium, men and women ranging in age from their 30s to their 80s, representing conflicts from Vietnam through the recent withdrawals from Iraq and Afghanistan. They wore their service with quiet dignity, some in dress uniforms, others in civilian clothes marked by military pins and insignia. Aaron Lewis sat with his fellow ROTC cadets in a designated section to the right of the main assembly. At 16, he was one of the program's most dedicated members, carrying himself with the kind of serious purpose that suggested military service might be in his future. His dress blue uniform was immaculate, his posture perfect, his attention focused on the ceremony proceedings. But part of his mind kept drifting back to the man he had seen sitting on the bench outside the school. There had been something familiar about him, something that tugged at the edges of memory in a way that was both compelling and frustrating. As Principal Martinez introduced the first veteran speaker, a Marine who had served in Iraq, Aaron found himself glancing toward the gymnasium windows that faced the front of the school. He could not see the bench from his current position, but he knew the man was still out there, excluded from a ceremony that was supposed to honor people exactly like him. The Marine's speech was powerful and moving, filled with stories of brotherhood and sacrifice that resonated through the assembled crowd. He spoke about the weight of carrying memories, about the responsibility that came with survival, about the importance of remembering those who had not made it home. Service does not end when you take off the uniform, the Marine concluded. It continues in how you live your life, how you treat others, how you pass on the values that define us as Americans. The applause was thunderous, and Aaron joined in with genuine appreciation. But even as he clapped, his mind was working, trying to place the face he had seen outside. There was something about the man's bearing, his age, the way he had sat with such patient dignity despite being turned away. During the brief intermission between speakers, Aaron leaned over to whisper to his friend Marcus, who sat beside him in the ROTC section. "That guy outside," Aaron said quietly. "The one on the bench. I think I know who he is." Marcus glanced toward the windows, though he could not see anything from their current position. "What guy?" "There is an old man sitting outside. The security guard would not let him in. But I think—" Aaron paused, trying to organize his thoughts. "My grandfather used to talk about a teacher here. His old ROTC instructor. Said he was a veteran, served in Afghanistan. Lots of teachers are veterans," Marcus pointed out practically. "Yeah, but this was different," Aaron continued, his voice still low to avoid disrupting the ceremony. "My grandfather said this guy saved his life. Not in school, in the military. They served together, and this teacher pulled him out of some kind of ambush or attack." Marcus's expression grew more interested. "What was his name?" Aaron closed his eyes, trying to remember the stories his grandfather had told him over the years. Jeremy Lewis had been a proud veteran of the Afghanistan conflict, but he had also been a man who did not talk easily about his combat experiences. The few stories he had shared were treasured family memories, told quietly during fishing trips or late-night conversations when Aaron had stayed over at his grandparents' house. "Moore," Aaron said suddenly, the name coming back to him like a key turning in a lock. "Elijah Moore. Sergeant Moore. My grandfather called him the best teacher he ever had, and the bravest soldier he ever served with." The second speaker was being introduced, a Navy veteran who had served aboard submarines. But Aaron's attention was completely focused now on the connection he was making. His grandfather had died 2 years earlier, but the stories remained vivid in Aaron's memory. Jeremy Lewis had been a young private during his deployment to Afghanistan, part of a supply convoy that had been ambushed outside Kandahar in 2004. The attack had been devastating, several vehicles destroyed, multiple casualties, chaos and confusion as soldiers tried to establish defensive positions while under heavy fire. According to Jeremy's account, which had been shared in fragments over the years. Sergeant Elijah Moore had been part of a rapid response team that had arrived to assist the convoy. But Moore had done more than provide backup. He had repeatedly exposed himself to enemy fire to pull wounded soldiers to safety, coordinating medical evacuation while maintaining defensive positions. Jeremy Lewis had been unconscious for part of the engagement, suffering from a concussion and shrapnel wounds. But he had awakened in a field hospital to learn that Sergeant Moore had been the one to carry him to the evacuation helicopter, running across open ground while machine gun fire kicked up sand around his feet. He never acted like it was a big deal. Aaron remembered his grandfather saying, "Came to visit me in the hospital, brought me some books, asked about my family. Found out later he had recommended me for early rotation home because of my injuries. Never mentioned that he had been the one to save my life." The connection between the soldier his grandfather had described and the teacher who had worked at Franklin High had been revealed years later, when Jeremy Lewis had decided to visit his old school and thank the man who had shaped his character both in combat and in the classroom. Aaron felt a growing sense of urgency as the pieces of the story came together in his mind. If the man sitting outside was indeed Elijah Moore, then he was not just any veteran being excluded from the ceremony. He was a genuine hero, a man who had saved lives in combat and then dedicated his civilian career to shaping young minds. The Navy veteran finished her speech to strong applause, and Principal Martinez stepped back to the podium to introduce the final speaker of the morning. But Aaron was no longer listening to the official program. Instead, he was making a decision that felt both impulsive and absolutely necessary. He leaned over to Marcus again. "I need to go check on something," he whispered. "Now." Marcus looked confused. "We are supposed to stay with the group." "This is important," Aaron said, already starting to rise from his seat. "Cover for me if anyone asks." Before Marcus could protest further, Aaron was moving toward the side exit of the gymnasium, walking with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested official business rather than unauthorized absence. He had learned from his ROTC training that confidence could often substitute for permission when the situation warranted it. The hallway outside the gymnasium was empty except for a few custodial staff members who were preparing for the post-assembly cleanup. Aaron walked quickly toward the main entrance, his dress shoes clicking against the polished floor with military precision. Through the glass doors, he could see the man still sitting on the bench. He was older than Aaron had initially thought, probably in his mid-70s, but he carried himself with the kind of bearing that spoke of decades of discipline and service. His gray blazer was neat but worn, his baseball cap positioned with military precision. Aaron pushed through the doors and walked directly toward the bench, his heart beating faster as he approached. The man looked up as he drew near, and Aaron saw eyes that were both kind and alert, the eyes of someone who had spent years observing and assessing situations. "Excuse me, sir," Aaron said, coming to a stop in front of the bench and unconsciously assuming an at-attention posture. "Are you Sergeant Moore?" "Elijah Moore." The man's expression shifted slightly, surprise mixing with something that might have been recognition. "I am," he said quietly. "And you are?" "Aaron Lewis, sir. My grandfather was Jeremy Lewis. Private Jeremy Lewis, 2004, Afghanistan." For a moment, the two of them simply looked at each other. Then something profound happened in Elijah Moore's weathered face. A softening, a brightening, as if a light had been turned on in a room that had been dark for too long. "Jeremy Lewis," Elijah repeated, his voice carrying a mixture of surprise and warmth. "How is Jeremy? It has been far too long since we spoke." Aaron felt his throat tighten slightly. "He passed away 2 years ago, sir. Cancer. But he talked about you all the time. About what you did for him in Afghanistan. About how you taught him here at Franklin High." Elijah's face fell, and he was quiet for a long moment. "I am sorry for your loss," he said finally. "Jeremy was a good soldier and a fine young man. He had a family, I remember. Children. My father," Aaron said. "And my aunt. And grandchildren, me and my sister. He lived a full life, sir. Because of you." The weight of that statement hung in the air between them. Elijah looked down at his hands, then back up at Aaron with an expression that was difficult to read. "I just did my job," Elijah said quietly. "Same as everyone else out there." "No, sir," Aaron said with the kind of respectful firmness that his ROTC training had taught him. "My grandfather told me what really happened. How you went back 3 times to get wounded soldiers. How you called in the medical evacuation while you were still taking fire. How you visited him in the hospital and never told him you were the one who saved his life. Elijah stood up slowly, his movements careful but dignified. Your grandfather was a brave young man who served his country with honor. He earned his way home. Because you made sure he got there, Aaron replied. And then you came here and taught other young people how to serve, how to be brave, how to do the right thing. He paused, gathering his courage for what he knew he had to do next. Sir, there's a Veterans Day assembly happening right now inside this school. An assembly that you started when you taught here. And you were sitting outside because they would not let you in. Elijah nodded. Security policies. I understand. No, sir, Aaron said, his voice growing stronger. It is not right. You belong in there, not as a guest, but as someone who should be honored. Before Elijah could respond, Aaron was already moving toward the school entrance, gesturing for the older man to follow him. The security guard looked up as they approached, his expression shifting to one of confusion. Sir, the guard said to Aaron, you should be in the assembly. And I already explained to this gentleman. His name is Sergeant Elijah Moore. Aaron interrupted, his voice carrying the kind of authority that surprised even him. He taught here for 22 years. He started the Veterans Day Assembly. And he saved my grandfather's life in Afghanistan. The guard looked between Aaron and Elijah, clearly uncertain about how to handle this unexpected development. I still need proper authorization, the guard began. Then you are going to get it, Aaron said firmly. Because I am going to bring him inside, and I am going to tell everyone in that gymnasium exactly who he is and what he has done. Without waiting for further discussion, Aaron opened the door and held it for Elijah. The older man hesitated for just a moment, then walked through the entrance with the same quiet dignity he had maintained throughout the morning. As they walked down the hallway toward the gymnasium, Aaron could hear the sound of applause echoing from inside. The final speaker had apparently concluded, and Principal Martinez was likely beginning her closing remarks. Are you sure about this? Elijah asked quietly as they approached the gymnasium doors. Aaron looked at him with the serious expression of a young man who had discovered something important about courage and responsibility. My grandfather spent the last 20 years of his life telling people about the teacher who saved him twice, once in Afghanistan and once in a classroom. The least I can do is make sure people know he was right. He pushed open the gymnasium doors, and together they walked into the Veterans Day assembly that Elijah Moore had created, but had been excluded from, until a boy who remembered decided that some things were more important than guest lists and security protocols. The gymnasium doors closed behind them with a soft whisper that seemed to echo in the sudden hush that fell over the assembled crowd. Principal Martinez had been in the middle of her closing remarks when Aaron Lewis and Elijah Moore entered, and something about their purposeful stride down the center aisle caused conversations to fade and heads to turn. Aaron walked with military bearing, his ROTC uniform crisp and his expression determined. Beside him, Elijah Moore moved with the measured pace of a man who had learned to carry himself with dignity regardless of circumstances. The contrast between the 16-year-old cadet and the 76-year-old veteran created a powerful image that rippled through the crowd like a stone dropped in still water. Principal Martinez paused mid-sentence, her eyes following the unexpected procession. The microphone in her hand picked up the slight intake of breath that preceded her confusion. Aaron, is everything all right? Aaron did not break stride until he reached the front of the gymnasium, positioning himself near the speaker's podium where his voice would carry clearly through the wireless sound system. Elijah stopped beside him, his weathered hands clasped behind his back in a posture that spoke of decades of standing at attention. Principal Martinez, Aaron said, his young voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to do. I apologize for the interruption, but there is something important that needs to be said. The gymnasium had fallen completely silent now. Nearly 400 people, students, parents, teachers, and invited veterans, focused their attention on the unlikely pair standing before them. Some of the ROTC cadets in Aaron's section were sitting forward in their seats, recognizing that their fellow cadet was about to do something significant. Principal Martinez looked uncertain, caught between maintaining the structure of the planned ceremony and addressing what was clearly an unscripted but purposeful intervention. Aaron, if there is an issue, perhaps we should discuss it after? No, ma'am. Aaron interrupted with respectful firmness. This cannot wait. Because we have been sitting here for the past hour talking about heroes and service and sacrifice, while one of the greatest heroes this school has ever known was sitting outside on a bench because we would not let him in. He gestured toward Elijah, who remained standing quietly beside him, his expression unreadable but his bearing unmistakably that of a man who had spent his life in service to others. "This is Sergeant Elijah Moore," Aaron continued, his voice growing stronger as he found his rhythm. He taught ROTC at this school for 22 years. He started the Veterans Day Assembly that we just finished celebrating. And before he taught here, he served 2 tours in Afghanistan, where he saved the lives of American soldiers under enemy fire. A murmur began to spread through the crowd, students and parents exchanging glances as they tried to process this unexpected revelation. Some of the invited veterans in the front section were leaning forward, studying Elijah with the kind of recognition that comes from shared experience. "My grandfather was one of those soldiers," Aaron said, his voice carrying clearly through the gymnasium's sound system. "Private Jeremy Lewis, 2004, Kandahar Province. His convoy was ambushed, and Sergeant Moore ran across open ground 3 separate times to pull wounded men to safety. My grandfather was unconscious, bleeding, trapped in a burning vehicle. Sergeant Moore carried him to the evacuation helicopter while machine gun fire was hitting the sand around his feet." The silence in the gymnasium was now complete and profound. Even the youngest students seemed to understand that they were witnessing something extraordinary, a moment when the abstract concepts of heroism and service suddenly became personal and immediate. "My grandfather lived because of Sergeant Moore," Aaron continued. "He came home, married my grandmother, had children, got to see his grandchildren grow up. He spent the last 20 years of his life telling anyone who would listen about the teacher who saved him twice, once on a battlefield in Afghanistan, and once in a classroom right here at Franklin High." Aaron turned slightly to look at Elijah, who was standing with his head slightly bowed, clearly moved by the public recounting of events he had never spoken about himself. "Sergeant Moore never told my grandfather that he had recommended him for early rotation home because of his injuries. Never mentioned that he had been the one to carry him to safety. My grandfather only found that out years later, when he came back to this school to thank the teacher who had shaped his character and discovered it was the same man who had saved his life." Principal Martinez had lowered her microphone, her expression shifting from confusion to understanding as the weight of Aaron's words settled over the assembled crowd. She looked at Elijah with new eyes, seeing not an uninvited intruder, but a man whose contributions to their school and community had been overlooked. "This morning," Aaron said, his voice beginning to carry the emotional weight of what he was sharing, "Sergeant Moore came to our Veterans Day Assembly. The assembly he created, the tradition he started. And we turned him away because his name was not on a guest list." The murmur from the crowd was no longer confused but indignant. Students who had been only half listening to the earlier speeches were now completely engaged, understanding that they were witnessing something that would be remembered long after the formal presentations were forgotten. Aaron looked out over the assembled faces, seeing his fellow ROTC cadets, his teachers, his classmates, the parents and community members who had come to honor veterans. When he spoke again, his voice carried the kind of moral authority that transcended age and rank. "We spent this morning listening to speeches about service and sacrifice, about remembering those who served, about honoring the men and women who put their lives on the line for our freedom. And the whole time, one of those heroes was sitting outside on a bench, excluded from his own ceremony." He paused, gathering himself for what he knew would be the most important words he had ever spoken in public. "Sergeant Moore taught my grandfather and hundreds of other students that courage is not about being fearless. It is about doing what is right even when you are afraid. That leadership is not about giving orders, but about taking care of the people who depend on you. That honor is not something you claim for yourself, but something you earn through your actions." Aaron's voice cracked slightly with emotion, but he pressed on. "My grandfather died 2 years ago, but he made me promise to always remember the lessons that Sergeant Moore taught him, about duty and honor and putting others before yourself. And standing here today, looking at this man who has given so much and asked for so little in return, I realize that the most important lesson is the one we almost missed." He looked directly at Principal Martinez, then swept his gaze across the entire assembled crowd. The lesson is that true heroes do not always announce themselves. They do not always wear medals or carry invitations. Sometimes they just show up, quietly and consistently, doing what needs to be done because it needs doing. Sometimes they sit on benches outside the ceremonies held in their honor because they understand that the ceremony is not about them. It is about the values they represent. The gymnasium was so quiet that the slight hum of the ventilation system seemed loud in comparison. Aaron could see tears in the eyes of several veterans in the front section, and even some of his fellow students were visibly moved by the story they were hearing. "Sergeant Moore," Aaron said, turning to face the man beside him, "you were not on the guest list today, but you should not have been a guest at all. You should have been the guest of honor." For a moment, the two of them stood together in the silence of the gymnasium, the young cadet and the old soldier, separated by 60 years but connected by a bond of service and sacrifice that transcended generations. Then something extraordinary happened. Marcus Williams, Aaron's friend from the ROTC section, stood up. He did not applaud or cheer. He simply rose to his feet and stood at attention, his eyes fixed on Elijah Moore with the kind of respect that spoke louder than words. One by one, the other ROTC cadets followed suit. Then the invited veterans in the front section. Then parents and teachers and students throughout the gymnasium. Within 30 seconds, nearly 400 people were standing in silent tribute to a man who had never asked for recognition but had earned it through a lifetime of quiet service. The standing ovation that followed was unlike anything Franklin High School had ever experienced. It was not the polite applause that typically marked the end of school assemblies, nor the enthusiastic cheering that accompanied athletic victories. It was something deeper and more profound, a recognition of authentic heroism, an acknowledgement of debt owed, a moment of collective understanding about what truly mattered. Elijah Moore stood in the center of it all, overwhelmed by the sudden attention, but maintaining the dignified bearing that had characterized his entire adult life. Tears ran down his weathered cheeks, but his shoulders remained straight and his head held high. Principal Martinez approached him with the microphone, offering it with an expression that mixed apology with deep respect. "Sergeant Moore," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the sound system, "would you like to say something to our students?" Elijah accepted the microphone with hands that trembled slightly, not from age but from emotion. He looked out over the sea of faces, young and old, students and teachers, veterans and civilians. All of them focused on him with an attention that was both humbling and inspiring. "I want to thank Aaron Lewis," he began, his voice steady despite his obvious emotion, "for reminding all of us that courage comes in many forms. What he did today, standing up for what he believed was right, even when it meant interrupting an official ceremony, that takes a different kind of bravery than what we usually talk about on Veterans Day." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I also want to thank all of you for your attention today, but I need you to understand something important. I am not the hero of this story. The heroes are the young men like Jeremy Lewis who answered their country's call and served with honor. The heroes are the teachers who show up every day to shape young minds. The heroes are the students like Aaron who choose to stand up for what is right even when it is difficult." Elijah looked directly at the ROTC section, his eyes finding each cadet in turn. 22 years ago, I started this assembly because I believed that young people needed to understand the cost of freedom. Not just the cost paid by soldiers in distant battles, but the cost paid every day by people who choose service over self-interest, duty over convenience, honor over easy popularity. His voice grew stronger as he continued. "Today, you have given me a great gift. Not the applause or the recognition, but the proof that the lessons we tried to teach are still alive in the next generation." Aaron Lewis honored his grandfather's memory today, but more than that, he honored the values that make all service meaningful. Elijah handed the microphone back to Principal Martinez and stepped back, but the crowd was not finished with him. The applause resumed, even stronger than before, and continued for what felt like several minutes. When it finally subsided, Principal Martinez took the microphone for what everyone understood would be the actual conclusion of the assembly. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying a formality that marked official pronouncements, "I want to make an announcement on behalf of the Franklin High School administration and the Board of Education." The gymnasium fell silent once again, everyone sensing that something significant was about to be said. Effective immediately, Principal Martinez continued. We are establishing the Elijah Moore Scholarship for ROTC Excellence, to be awarded annually to a graduating senior who demonstrates not just military aptitude, but the kind of moral courage and commitment to service that Sergeant Moore has exemplified throughout his career. The applause that followed was immediate and sustained, but Principal Martinez held up her hand to indicate she was not finished. Furthermore, she said, we are dedicating the new ROTC wing of our building, currently under construction, as the Elijah Moore Center for Leadership and Service. Because true leadership is not about commanding others, but about inspiring them to be better than they thought possible. Elijah looked stunned by these announcements, clearly unprepared for such recognition. But before he could respond, Principal Martinez continued. And finally, I want to extend a formal invitation to Sergeant Moore to serve as our honorary advisor for the ROTC program, and as the keynote speaker for our Veterans Day Assembly every year for as long as he is willing to serve. The final ovation was thunderous, with students cheering and veterans saluting, and the entire gymnasium united in a moment of celebration that transcended the usual boundaries of age and experience. Later that afternoon, after the crowd had dispersed and the gymnasium had been restored to its usual configuration, Elijah Moore sat in the classroom that had once been his own, surrounded by current ROTC cadets who wanted to hear more about his experiences and his philosophy of service. Aaron Lewis sat in the front row, no longer the confident young man who had interrupted a school assembly, but a teenager who was beginning to understand the weight of the legacy he had helped to preserve. Sergeant Moore, one of the cadets asked, what do you want us to remember most about today? Elijah thought for a moment, his eyes taking in the young faces around him. Faces that reminded him of all the students he had taught over the years, all the soldiers he had served with, all the young people who represented the future of the country he had devoted his life to serving. I want you to remember that heroism is not a moment, he said finally. It is a choice you make every day. The choice to see what needs doing and to do it, regardless of whether anyone notices or thanks you. The choice to stand up for what is right even when it is difficult. The choice to serve something larger than yourself. He looked directly at Aaron. And I want you to remember that sometimes the most important thing you can do is refuse to let good people be forgotten. Aaron did not just honor his grandfather today. He honored every veteran who has ever served quietly and without recognition. He reminded all of us that memory is not passive, it requires action. As the afternoon light faded through the classroom windows, Elijah Moore, teacher, soldier, and now official honorary advisor, continued to do what he had always done best, helping young people understand that they had the power to make a difference in the world, one choice at a time. The Veterans Day Assembly had ended, but the real ceremony, the daily practice of service and honor and remembrance, would continue for as long as there were people willing to carry it forward. And thanks to a 16-year-old cadet who remembered his grandfather's stories, that tradition was now in very good hands indeed. The end.